So we're with Bruce Robertson, gas analyst at IEEFA, the Progressive Analysis Institution, which looks at fossil fuels. So Bruce, you came down for a gas conference in Sydney this week. Do you have any problem getting here?
Oh, more than a little bit, Michael. My farm, after being ringed with fire last year, was ringed with flood this year, and I had to canoe out of my farm to a car on the road opposite and come on down for the gas conference. So it was rather an interesting week for me.
Good. Good to see climate change in action. Was there any urgency at the gas conference about climate change?
No, really, it wasn't really something that was mentioned too much. It was quite extraordinary how little carbon tariffs and carbon pricing was mentioned, given that that's what we face.
So tell us, what's the state of play then? What were the things that were most discussed by industry at the gas conference?
Well, the most discussed thing was the supply cliff that we're facing in 2024, which is always very scary. As you know, Michael, back from history, this isn't the first supply cliff we've faced. We faced one back in 2016, I believe, when AGL kindly told us that if you wanted to cook your bacon and eggs in Sydney, there wasn't going to be any gas by 2016. But of course they were wrong. There's so much gas in Australia. We are swimming in gas.
So the irony that Australia is now the biggest supplier of gas globally, the biggest exporter, it's even leapfrog Qatar, yet Australians face incredibly high prices at home for their gas.
Well, not only at home, but industry. Everyone faces high prices for gas in Australia. And the best way of looking at this is that there are 6 import terminals proposed for Australia to import gas into the world's largest gas exporter, because the prices we pay here are so high that you can spend $300 million on an import terminal and still make money. You can still make money. The prices are that high in Australia. And not only that, if they're all built, which I don't think they will be incidentally, but if they were all built, these 6 import terminals, Australia would become a solely import supplied market. We wouldn't get 1 gigajoule of gas from Australia. We would get it all from imports.
It would still go overseas. So Bruce was the first to make the observation that retail customers in Japan were paying lower prices for Australian gas than Australia. Is that still the case now?
Well, no, it's not so much the case now. We still do pay more at a wholesale level than you do in Japan. And this is the key point. Our industry is really struggling to compete, the gas-intensive industry. And what it's leading to is what's known in economics as demand destruction. So the gas industry is all worried about supply, but how that supply is going to be filled is by destroying demand. They don't look at the other side of the picture. Economics is 2 sides of the picture. You have supply and you have demand.
So they've shot themselves in the foot, you're saying, because they've been too greedy and forced the price of gas up so much that it's destroyed demand.
Yes, industry, gas use in industry has fallen by 14% since 2014. Gas use for gas-powered generation has fallen an incredible 58% since 2014, and there's no end in sight for gas-powered generation in terms of the decline in gas usage. We are going to continue to see massive demand destruction in that area because simply gas is too expensive. And so what we've seen just since November is 3 gigawatts of battery projects announced. Now, these projects are very likely to come to fruition because you need 3 things for a battery project. You need capital, you need a connection point, and you need land. And nearly all these projects tick those 3 boxes already. So they're very likely to go ahead, and they will ensure that gas winds its way out of the energy system. So gas, far from being a transition fuel, it's a fuel transitioning out of the energy system.
Was there any embracing of this reality by the gas industry at the conference? I mean, is the gas still the transition fuel as far as they're concerned, as far as industry is concerned?
Well, they are marketing it to the government as a transition fuel. But if we are serious about Paris and the Paris climate commitments, and if our customers are serious about all their Paris commitments, and they've actually made them, Michael, unlike us, they've actually made climate commitments. Japan, Korea, China have all made net zero climate commitments. You know, China in 2060, Japan 2050, Korea 2050. There are major gas customers, LNG customers. They've all said, we're going net zero in 2050. They've only just made these commitments, and the implementation of them will happen over the next several years. And increasingly, they will realise that to meet Paris, we cannot develop 1 gigajoule of undeveloped gas resources. Now, our government is forcing the development of the Beetaloo Basin, the Barossa offshore field off Darwin, new fields off the Northwest Shelf, fracking in the Kimberley, fracking in Narrabri. They're looking at opening up onshore gas in Victoria. We are talking about a massive expansion of the gas industry in Australia.
And this is despite the fact that over the last few years, the price of gas globally, there's a glut, has plummeted.
Yes.
So they're massively expanding supply at a time when the price internationally has collapsed.
And demand will falter. It has to falter. If there's any semblance about reality about the 2050 commitments, demand will go down. And in Australia, not only have we seen industry and gas-powered generation demand fall, but domestic consumption, which to date has been very flat, will start to fall quite radically. And it'll start to fall because the Victorian government has actually spent $700 million getting people off old gas heaters onto newer, more efficient reverse cycle air conditioners. And so what is happening is we will begin to see domestic demand fall. AGL, Australian Gas Light Company itself, says that it's cheaper to heat your home and do your hot water and cook with electricity than it is with gas. Gas, if you look in the long history, gas was developed because we had cheap gas out of Moomba and out of the Bass Strait. That's all gone, and the gas industry realises this. They're telling us we have to pay higher prices because we have to pay for the very high cost CSG up in Queensland. Well, there are alternatives now, and we don't have to pay that. We can just electrify our homes, and it's cheaper, it's more efficient. You don't have the emissions out of your gas stove, you know, choking your kiddies. So just convert your homes.
But they're sticking to the transition thing in terms of government at the moment, the gas transition. So my question is, how are we going to be subsidising this? What are the public subsidies involved in this? Are they still talking about the East-West pipeline?
Well, there's talking about that, which is an absolute furphy, and a lot of people in the gas industry realise that because it's much cheaper just to use a liquefied natural gas and ship it rather than the expensive costs of pipelines. A pipeline of that length is absurd for the small demand we have on the East Coast. So that will not be a project, I believe, that should go ahead, but you never know with this government. They like subsidising things a lot. For a supposedly free market government, there isn't a free market bone in their body when it comes to gas. It's all about subsidies.
So what are the subsidies? Because there was another 300 million the other day announced, wasn't there?
Yeah, well, the big ones we've got to watch out for, the really big ones that are almost unquantifiable, are the idea that the government will underwrite the offtake of a gas pipeline. In other words, they'll say we'll buy all the gas coming out of that pipeline for the next 20 years or 30 years, and then we will on-sell it. Now, what that will do is that will leave them with a stranded asset. In other words, they will be paying the pipeline owner in 10 years' time for gas that they can't sell. And that's what's going to happen. We're going to have this massive financial liability put on the Australian taxpayer by this current government. And because we are at a time when gas is winding its way out of the energy system. It has to if we are to meet our climate goals.
Is it plausible that the gas industry, well, they've got a lot of analysts and they're still very well heeled, know all this and realise it, so they're ramping up production as much as possible, claiming as much in government subsidies, public subsidies as possible, having a big multi-year last hurrah before they know it's all over and renewables do away with gas?
They do know it's all over. They do know it's all over, and you're dead right. They're trying to lock gas in for the next 30 years into the energy system when it doesn't have a 30-year life. And they're trying to do that not only by doing this in Australia, they're heavily promoting gas, both the US and the Australian governments. It's not just the Australian government, the US government and the Qataris are heavily promoting gas. And that's one thing we haven't hit on here, Michael. We haven't talked about the Qataris. So maybe we should.
The Qataris used to be the biggest gas producers until we took them over a couple of years ago.
Yeah, we did indeed, but they are about to come back in force. The Qataris have announced that they want to increase their gas production by 40%. In the short term, they're going to take it from 70 million tonnes up to 110, and then eventually 126 million tonnes. And the Qataris produce the cheapest gas in the world and the cheapest LNG with carbon capture and storage by a country mile. They are so cheap. And so the Australian LNG projects are looking at competing with massive expansion out of Qatar at incredibly cheap prices. They can put it on the ship at $4 an MMBTU. We can't get it out of our fields for that.
You're talking about the fracking fields, of course.
Yeah, no, we can't produce it at the wellhead for that, let alone transport it to the LNG facilities, go through the hugely expensive liquefaction process and then the shipping process. So the Qataris are far more cost competitive than we are, and are selling gas cheaply now. They've dropped the price by about 22% for LNG, and they're selling it at an oil-linked price that's far, far cheaper than we ever have sold gas at.
But the producers, of course, say that they do their fair bit by paying tax and so on and royalties. I mean, is that true?
Well, look, I think we really have to ask the gas industry that. And yesterday, the CEO of Strike Energy said very clearly that Australia is the second best country in the world to operate from a tax point of view. In other words, we don't tax them much at all.
Do we know who the best is?
We actually don't know who the best is. I'd love to ask him that question, but I'd guess it's somewhere like Qatar, who all the gas is actually owned by the government. So the government taxing itself really doesn't make a lot of sense.
So this claim that they've got a high tax burden and that there's too much regulation in Australia is not true either.
Well, no, we are the lowest, or well, the second lowest tax jurisdiction in the world, according to the CEO of Strike Energy, in the world for tax.
So then how do we get to a situation with this abundant resource and we're swimming in gas with a very benign tax environment? How do we get to this situation where prices are so high then? Is the market not functioning?
Well, Michael, this is where I go.
Is there a market? Is there a market?
Well, this is where I go back to first year economics. My first year economics when I was at Sydney Uni, I learned about markets. And markets are things where there are multiple buyers and multiple sellers. And yesterday at the gas conference, I was told again that the problem with Australia is that there isn't really a market. There's only 5 buyers and 5 big sellers of gas.
So it's more of a cartel
6.
than a market then, is that what you're saying?
Yes, it's a very tightly controlled oligopoly, and
okay. So who have we got? We've got Exxon, BHP.
Exxon, BHP, and the Bass Strait. We've got Origin Energy. We've got Shell. We've got Santos, and you might be able to throw in Beach Energy. There may be 6.
And Strike's in the Beetaloo, isn't it?
No, Strike Energy's in WA. It's in Western Australia, yeah. So they've got a big onshore gas project in WA, and they're looking to build a big fertiliser, urea factory off the back of that. So they're looking at being both a gas producer and a manufacturer.
To that point about the buyers of gas being penalised, we've talked about the mums and dads and just the high prices until last year. when it's sort of hard that we had to endure. But it's a drag on the whole industry, is your point, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of industrial gas consumers which are penalised by this too, which goes to their cost base and drives the cost of everything up.
Well, indeed, and also it has tremendous social implications. Yesterday we heard from the Energy Users Association CEO, and he was saying that a number of his clients are not big. You know, they're small canneries in regional areas that are essentially the only employer in the town, and they might employ, 1,000 people or something. And they were facing very tough times due to the high gas prices that they were enduring and having to pay. And in the end, it may mean tremendous social dislocation in those regional areas. And then there are the large users like Qenos down in Victoria. And they too were saying that the prices they're paying are not sustainable. The government has actually asked the industry and the big, the industry associations and the gas industry to sit down and try and negotiate a reasonable price for gas in Australia. But of course that hasn't happened. So what we're doing is we're subsidising an industry that's charging us very high prices for gas and is sending industry bankrupt. It's that simple. That's what's happening today in Australia. Our government is subsidising an industry that is being very, very harsh on Australian domestic consumers.
Right, and what about the other side of the equation, the one which worries a lot of people, the environmental impact of gas? Can we just look at, for instance, Santos at Narrabri, that's just been approved.
Yeah.
Have they got their environment issues squared away yet?
No, they're actually being challenged in court presently. And Penny Sackett, who was the chief scientist for Australia, so a very, very credible source. I urge people to listen to her evidence at the Narrabri inquiry. Basically, it was that we cannot afford to develop Narrabri. But there is currently an appeal on it over the fact her evidence was flatly ignored at the time that a lot of women's issues at the moment in Australian politics. It's interesting that she was a woman who, again, was flatly ignored, and an extremely capable and brilliant woman at that. But her evidence was flatly ignored by the three white men in grey suits who were presiding over the panel.
Right, there's no surprise there, I guess. For our report into royalties in Australia, we're trying to evaluate whether the big companies are paying enough royalties. This is besides their tax, of course, because royalties are not tax. They are the amount paid for the minerals that are extracted from our soils and our seabeds. Can you tell us what you see as the major problems with the royalties regime in Australia?
The major problem with the royalty regime in Australia is it doesn't collect royalties for oil and gas. The numbers we're talking about are incredibly small. For the Queensland CSG industry, it's going to be around $300 million this coming year. $300 million makes that a loss-making business for the government. And by that I mean it's going to cost way more in infrastructure that they have to build and maintain for the gas industry than the royalties they are getting out of it.
So production's going up, are royalties going up too?
No, royalties are falling both for PRRT and in Queensland for the coal seam gas royalties are expected to fall this year from last year's levels.
And why is that? Because they're based on price and price has been falling?
Well, the PRRT is a broken tax. I mean, essentially, it allows the companies to continually upscale their losses. They get what's called an upscale. So their losses grow even though they don't grow. It's a broken tax.
Okay, so just on top of the fairly skimpy royalties and tax equation, taxpayers are also, the public is also on the hook for paying for the infrastructure, isn't it? I mean, do the gas industry, do they pay for this stuff themselves or do we have to fund it for them?
No, we undoubtedly fund it for them. In the Northern Territory, the government's just announced a $160 million program to fund roads
This is Northern Territory taxpayers that will be paying for this.
Well, it's
Or
federal tax. Us.
They're easy to touch up than they are up there.
Yeah, they don't have a lot of money up there. So basically, that's what's occurring. We're funding the roads and the infrastructure, and they'll pay no tax and no royalties.
What about water?
Well, they don't pay for the water either.
And it's highly water intensive.
Oh yeah, it takes an awful lot of water out of the ground, deep out of the ground, yes. Very water intensive.
Okay, so on the whole, we have an incredibly toxic, in terms of climate change, industry that is helping to put the carbon emissions to blow Australia's carbon emissions out of the water. We've got an industry which has no, in terms of fracking, no globally accepted plan for disposing of waste. An industry which is subsidised by taxpayers, but doesn't pay enough in either taxes or royalties. How do they get away with it?
They have very good lobbyists in Canberra. I think APPEA is the premium lobbyist group in Australia. I really do. I think that they're brilliant at what they do. They extract an awful lot of money out of the government and give very little back.
They're also, of course, that's a good point, they're also among the gas companies are among the biggest donors to both major parties. So
the gas companies are amongst the biggest donors to both parties, both the Liberal and the Labor Party. They are there, and those parties are well and truly in the pocket of the gas industry.
Now, the gas industry claims that they are 50% better than coal on carbon emissions.
Well, it's one of those curious claims that's a dangerous half-truth, Michael, and that's the key point. It's a dangerous half-truth. Because if you look at the figures for a combined cycle plant, a baseload plant, they are 50% better for emissions, but only at the point that the gas is burnt. And this is the key point, because if you look at where the gas is burnt in Australia, it's in a peaking plant, because we need the peaking plants for renewable energy. And that's where the gas is burnt. And they are only 30% better than coal for emissions. Furthermore, if only 2 to 3% of the gas is leaked anywhere along the supply chain, gas is worse than coal for emissions. And BP, the oil and gas company, tells us that globally, around 3.2% of gas leaks or is vented or is flared.
This is sort of average per pipeline?
Average over the whole industry, the pipelines, the wells, all the way to the plants. So you only need a little bit of the dangerous, very highly dangerous greenhouse gas methane, which is what natural gas is, to leak, only 2 to 3%, and it's worse than coal. And BP tells you that their industry, the gas industry, is worse than coal for emissions. Gas is not a transition fuel, it's a high emitting fuel.
So where's the rest of the world going on the environmental equation of gas? What's happening in Europe and Scandinavia with their gas and so on, and Britain indeed? What's going on with gas and emissions?
Well, essentially, in Europe, you won't see any gas plants being built from now on. You'll see the existing ones getting run, but there'll be no new ones built because you won't be able to finance them. And the same thing is going to happen all around the globe eventually. It's going to take a few years for this to filter through, I believe, but basically we can't afford to have gas and have a climate. It's that simple.
So they're a few years behind coal, basically, in terms of industry acceptance, in terms of building new plants and so on, that this is the thing to do. Because, of course, in coal, it's now, apart from a few crazies, it's now accepted that there'll be no new coal-fired power plant in Australia. And that's going to be, well, we're still doing a feasibility study on Collinsville at great taxpayer expense, but that's sort of generally accepted now.
Well, we're doing a feasibility study, Michael, but the funny thing is they don't have enough money to complete it, even despite being given $3 million by the Australian government to do so, as the Audit Office pointed out, and the project is a complete joke.
So
it's just a big subsidy to some mate up in Queensland.
So it's generally accepted that coal-fired power it's winding down, no new plants, and you're saying that this is going to be the case with gas plants because of renewable energy, the deflation of renewable energy prices.
There are two things that are getting gas. One is economics is getting it, and the second thing that is definitely getting it is climate impacts. We can't afford, under Paris, no undeveloped gas can be developed. Australia is looking at a massive expansion in developing undeveloped fields, such as with the Beetaloo, Browse project,
Bowen,
Barossa off the Northern Territory, off the Northwest Shelf, all around the country.
the Galilee too.
The Galilee, the North Bowen Basin, all these are new undeveloped resources, and they're massive resources we're talking about. These are carbon bombs that Australia is setting off all around the country.
So we're going in exactly the wrong direction on both environment and in terms of sensible economic policy.
Oh, precisely. Look, the money is all flowing into renewables. You only have to look at where the money is going. It's going into renewables investment. We should follow the money. We should do the sensible economic thing. We should go for the lowest cost sources of power, which are now wind, solar and batteries. That's what it is. That's the lowest cost sources.
So with the fossil fuels, what's the government's plan for community transition? I mean, we've seen a little bit in the Latrobe Valley and so on with the closure there of the coal-fired power, but what's the government's all-over plan for all the people around Australia whose communities, whose towns and villages are exposed to this global market just coming to an end?
Look, it's appalling the way our politicians are treating their constituents. In the Hunter Valley near where I live, we have a member who goes on and on about how there's this bright future for coal that clearly doesn't exist. And really, Joel Fitzgibbon should be ashamed of himself. I think it is appalling the way he's treating his constituents, and a number of other politicians around the country likewise are treating their constituents as idiots. And it really shouldn't be done. We all know that this industry is coming to an end, and we need transition plans for these communities. We need new industry to move in and provide jobs and livelihood for these communities. I am disgusted by the way that these politicians are treating their communities.
Is there a general public understanding of this, that the subsidy should be for the future and for economic projects which create value for these towns in the future? I mean, is there community understanding of this on the land?
I don't.
Where there's an exposure to fossil fuels?
Particularly with coal. I think coal is imminent. What we're going to see with coal is going to be imminent. And why I say that, it's quite interesting, Michael, because there will still be being a lot of coal burnt. I'm not saying coal-fired power stations is going to go out the window tomorrow. But what will happen is a lot of the countries where we export coal to have a lot of coal themselves. India has a lot of coal. China has a lot of coal themselves, right? They import a lot, but they have a lot of coal. So when they start winding down coal-fired power stations, the people that will be affected first are not their own miners. They're not going to shut mines in China. They'll shut mines in the Hunter Valley. They'll shut mines in the Latrobe Valley. That's what they're going to do.
So it's the seaborne export coal market which is at stake.
Which is going to bear the brunt of the cuts in coal, and they will bear it first. And this is the key point. I'm not saying that coal's going to disappear overnight or anything silly like that. It's not. But the people that were at the pointy end of this is a seaborne trade for coal, and they're going to see the cuts first. And the constituents in the Hunter Valley, particularly, they're going to see it first. They're going to see it first. And not to be explaining this to their constituents and not to be leading. That's what we need. We need leadership. Not this waffle about coal having a bright future when clearly it doesn't.
What's the state of play with Adani? Are they excavating? What's going on up there in Queensland?
I believe it's still going ahead at present. Yes, I do believe it is. But
are the hundreds of thousands of jobs eventuating?
No. In a word, no. There aren't. You know, the mine will be fully automated if it ever does get going. All the trucks will be automated. They've already said that. The trains will all be automated. There aren't many jobs. Most of the jobs will be for people in Mumbai who will operate the computer-controlled trucks from Mumbai or wherever.
Well, thanks for giving us a few words of truth, because we see a lot of lies about the gas industry published constantly, not only by their own lobbies and various things, but also in the media, and a general lack of understanding. So much appreciate you coming in today, Bruce, to set us all straight on what's really going on with the gas cartel.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Josh, since the economy is going so well, can you chuck us a few dollars on Patreon and maybe buy the merch?